Bombshell reports tonight that Bob Mueller's boss talked about wiretapping President Trump or even ousting the President of the United States through the 25th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, that's, of course, the way that you remove a president who is deemed unable to handle the job. You need the support of the cabinet and the Congress. If you're hearing these words, if they're sinking in, then you know already this is not some Friday night news dump. This is a Friday night explosion. But these claims and these stories tonight are also hotly contested. They may portend an irreversible escalation in the handling of the Mueller probe itself and whether President Trump will seize on this report, which is in the New York Times, to pursue his own version of a Saturday night massacre. So given the sheer scale of this, we're going to start our broadcast here on The Beat a little differently tonight. We're going to begin with the context for these explosive leaks and some of the skepticism about them. Then I'm going to share with you exactly what we know, both the New York Times report and some conflicting accounts from some other very high-level sources, and then we'll turn to our experts. So, first, there's the context here. The heat on Donald Trump right now has never been hotter, with the DOJ flipping his former campaign chair and his longtime personal lawyer. In fact, it's only in the past days and weeks that the news leaked that both men are not only guilty, but are talking to Bob Mueller. So it's amidst that heat that now sources inside and outside the DOJ say it's no surprise that we're seeing fresh attacks on the DOJ leadership, maybe giving everything they've got. The NYT report focuses on a few comments that were made in a meeting that these sources say were either sarcastic jokes or were never acted on. And note how odd it is that conversations from well over a year ago would be leaking out right now at the boiling point of cooperation in this Russia probe. And before I read you the Times account, I want you to know what else we're learning. Tonight, the top Senate Democrat, Chuck Schumer, is warning against this entire story, against using these leaks as a pretext for Donald Trump to do what many think he's wanted to do for a long time, which is kneecap the Bob Mueller probe by firing Bob Mueller's boss, Rod Rosenstein. So that's the context. That's the congressional fallout at this hour. Now let me show you exactly what the New York Times is reporting. That Mueller's boss, Rod Rosenstein, was basically aghast at how Trump was operating after firing James Comey, and thus he secretly suggested recording Trump and discussed even the 25th Amendment. The idea of using a wire to, quote, secretly tape the president when he visited the White House, or of others doing so, since a key question at the time was whether Donald Trump fired James Comey to stop the Russia probe and whether the other officials should try to tape him during interviews over who would replace Comey. Now, the article reports that Rosenstein got into the mechanics of it, noting White House officials never checked his phone when he arrived for those meetings. And then there is the passage that is by far the most shocking, that is certainly rattling the internet, the claim that Rod Rosenstein thought he might get Jeff Sessions and John Kelly, who then headed DHS, to use the 25th Amendment to remove Trump. Now, the article includes Rosenstein denying this entire story as, quote, factually incorrect, and includes another DOJ official saying that someone at the meeting thought the Times was basically misconstruing the reference to a wire and that it was actually made, quote, sarcastically. Now, that is what the New York Times reports. This story obviously appears quite helpful to Donald Trump's view of a deep state Justice Department out to get him. And the Times does not claim its reporting is based on people who actually heard Rosenstein say any of those things. Let me point you to investigative journalist Marcy Wheeler, noting tonight not a single one of these people the Times quotes was actually a witness to the episodes. None of them had even read the memos memorializing the events directly and have instead simply been briefed secondhand. And then there are the other sources. And because this is so important, because this could potentially change everything, let's go through it in detail. Because late today, DOJ officials are telling NBC News the meeting in question in May was at a secure facility. It was a week after Trump fired Comey as FBI director and the day before Rosenstein made that big move to appoint Mueller. And this official tells us, quote, 7 people were there: Rosenstein, McCabe, who was then acting as Comey's replacement, an FBI lawyer, Lisa Page, and 4 career DOJ officials, including Scott Schools. And this is important because he's the career official who would later sign off on the decision to fire McCabe himself. Quote, Rosenstein and McCabe were arguing. And at one point, Rosenstein asked, well, what do you want me to do, Andy? Wear a wire? 2 DOJ officials say the remark was made sarcastically, according to what this official tells NBC. As for raising the issue of invoking the 25th Amendment, the senior DOJ official says there's a brief reference to it in a note about the meeting that was written again by McCabe. DAG, that would be Rosenstein, raises 25th Amendment, end quote. The official says the notes about the same meeting taken by Lisa Page don't reference it at all, and that Rosenstein didn't raise it. This person telling NBC the notion that he would want to talk about discussing this with Kelly makes no sense. He didn't even know Kelly then. Now, I can tell you the public timeline does back that up. Rosenstein had been in the post 3 weeks. Kelly was not a big player in the Trump White House at the time. He didn't become chief of staff till later in July. Now, as a DOJ lawyer, Rosenstein would know it also takes a lot more than just some cabinet members to really use the 25th Amendment. You need a supermajority in Congress, but the Republicans, of course, are in charge there. Now, this story is contested by the people involved. There's no doubt about one thing and why it is such a big story tonight. This now lives in the white-hot center of the controversy over what Trump's going to do about a Russia probe that is heading for the White House. Donald Trump's son is seizing on the report, saying it proves that DOJ's top guys will do anything in their power to undermine Donald Trump. Meanwhile, journalist Gabriel Sherman, who wrote a book on Fox News, is reporting tonight that the man you see there, former Fox executive Bill Shine, who now runs White House communications for Trump, is preparing a media plan to, quote, build public support for Trump to fire Rosenstein. And here is a new call from Fox anchor Laura Ingraham calling for Trump to do just that. So let's get to our experts now that we've laid out the multiple dimensions of this story. Kim Whaley is a law professor at the University of Baltimore. She was a federal prosecutor who worked directly with Rod Rosenstein. Nick Ackerman has much experience as a former Watergate special prosecutor. And part of the reporting I mentioned, NBC's intelligence and national security journalist Ken Delanian is here for what he knows about it. Kim, I begin with you. When you read the New York Times version, secondhand, of these things said by Rod Rosenstein, do they sound to you like things that he wanted to actively do, to run a wiretap and remove the president, or do you see them in some other light?
Well, what I know from Rod Rosenstein, and I have known him professionally and personally for a long time, is that he is a man of impeccable integrity, and he's really someone who believes in public service and the rule of law. And I think the question here is he's doing his job as Deputy Attorney General, and I don't think there's any question that he's been doing that. Now, of course, Donald Trump can fire him under Article 2 of the Constitution. He has the power to do that, but that will have repercussions that are important because, as you mentioned, Ari, really what's in the room is the fact that Vladimir Putin wants to destroy our democratic process. He wants to tear people apart, and part of that is attacking the career officials like Rod Rosenstein, who are working really hard to uncover what the Russians did to undermine our electoral process and to get to the bottom of it. So
you see this explicitly, as many of Mueller's allies have seen it, as Chuck Schumer was saying, as a potential pretext to try to go after Rosenstein. What do you make, though, specifically of the notion that he was talking about wearing a wire? I mean, there is a federal process that would govern that if it were even serious. Your view?
No, I wasn't there. I mean, Rod can, from time to time, make jokes. I mean, he's a serious guy, but he also has a sense of humor. And obviously, there was a tremendous amount of pressure in the room. Of course, I wasn't there, so there's no way that I can actually weigh in on what happened or didn't happen. But let's face it, the other elephant in the room is the fact that whether 25th Amendment was addressed or not, there are other people within the administration, this anonymous op-ed we saw in the New York Times, that have posited that might be appropriate. And we've seen publicly a president who is in chaos, who is close to corruption, if not corrupt, and there's incompetence throughout the executive branch. And as a constitutional law professor and someone who was in public service, I'm just deeply, deeply concerned about the structure of our government, because whether you're Democratic or Republican, when it becomes damaged, it's damaged for good. It's like a car that has the side swiped. New people can drive that car, but it's still going to be trashed until someone fixes it. And at this point, we're getting more and more broken, and it's very, very serious. I really hope Rosenstein can hang on in these deeply politicized times.
And Ken, digging into the people at the meeting, we'll put it on the screen because it's a lot to follow. There's Rosenstein, McCabe, Lisa Page, and these 4 career DOJ officials who are lesser known. McCabe, of course, was later fired, and we know Donald Trump reportedly started chewing him out the moment he became acting director on the phone and attacking his wife. Page resigned and, of course, was figured into a scandal that House Republicans had seized on. So you have Rosenstein left with those officials. What does your reporting tell us about the significance of what happened in that meeting?
Well, it's so hard to know what to believe, Ari, because, as you said, the Justice Department is pushing back on this vigorously, both to Pete Williams and to me. Senior Justice Department officials are saying it absolutely did not happen the way the New York Times is describing it. They're saying that Rosenstein's remark was sarcastic. And when you talk to people that know Rod, as Kim said, he has a dry wit, and people say that it's possible that he said something in jest that maybe Andy McCabe took seriously and wrote it down in a memo as if he really meant to wear a wire. But complicating this picture, Ari, is that the New York Times has reported in the last few minutes that there was a second instance where McCabe and Rosenstein talked about Rod Rosenstein potentially recording the president or wearing a wire. And the Justice Department, again, our sources are pushing back on that. And so it's really, the only thing I can say is there were 4 career people in the room in addition to those named people that you outlined. And so this is a knowable fact. I mean, all these people can be interviewed, and we can get to the bottom of it. We do have Andy McCabe's contemporaneous memo. And by the way, some Justice Department officials are suggesting, he has an axe to grind. He was fired by the FBI. But that wasn't true back in May 2017 when he wrote the memo. He was the deputy director of the FBI. And so I think his account should be given some credibility. But again, it's just a hall of mirrors. We have 2 diametrically opposing accounts here, Ari.
Nick?
Ari, I think this is just part of the overall effort to try and get rid of the Russian investigation. One piece of the context that you didn't mention was that last week Donald Trump came out and was actually trying to declassify all of the classified information that was surrounding the Russian investigation at the request of certain Republicans in the House that are trying to undermine and destroy this investigation. Just today, it was announced he wasn't going to do that, probably because some other people within the administration had prevailed upon him. So now we have another salvo out there trying to undermine this investigation, undermine Rod Rosenstein. If you look at the 2 items that are being talked about, one is the 25th Amendment. That is so cumbersome, the idea that anybody seriously could think that they could use the 25th Amendment here, where you've got to get a majority of the cabinet to then write to the Speaker and to the President pro temp of the Senate. And then, on top of that, the President can override that by writing another letter, and then the majority again of the cabinet members would have to write back to the Speaker and Senator pro temp, and there'd have to be a 2/3 vote of both chambers of Congress to remove the President. That's not going to happen. This amendment was designed for the situation where a president is really incapacitated, like Woodrow Wilson was.
Right. Stay with me, everybody. I want to add to our discussion founder and editor-at-large for the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol, who's kept an eye on all these things. Bill, you have been in White Houses where everyone parses the leaks. And this one is quite interesting. I want to read more from the New York Times piece because the New York Times has clearly come down on the idea that Rosenstein said these things and it meant something. Not that they are misconstrued quotes. That's why their headline says Rosenstein suggests he secretly recorded Trump, although the article includes his denial. And I want to read from the article where it says, basically, Rosenstein made these remarks about secretly recording Trump in meetings and conversations with these officials. Several people described the episodes insisting on anonymity. These people, Bill, were briefed either on the events or on the memos. Does that look like a tell to you? Because we just went through on the screen all these anonymous people, as well as Rosenstein, who's got the on-the-record denial. The people doing the leaking that the Times finds credible are secondhand, having read some other description of it.
That could well be. And look, at the end of the day, either Rosenstein was rattled and said a few things that he didn't follow through on, and they were entirely speculative in terms of the 25th Amendment, and he knew he couldn't follow through on it. He knew he couldn't follow through on wearing a wiretap either, presumably. Or he was being witty, sort of gallows humor. Witty's not quite right, but just sardonic, let's say, and whatever. He didn't do it, right? He's been Deputy Attorney General for a year and a half now. We can judge his conduct in that job, and I believe almost every outside observer who doesn't have a axe to grind thinks his conduct has been pretty impressive, and that he has sustained the rule of law, defended the Mueller investigation. At times, some critics would say he's given it a little too much to the president's directives, but he is part of the administration after all. So I see no reason.
Let me push you on that, Bill. Do you think that if what you just said applies, then the Times got played?
Look, it's possible. I mean, reporters can get played, but they can also be reporting somewhat accurately, mostly accurately, slightly misunderstanding things. The McCabe contemporaneous memo is the strongest thing in there. On their side, I would say that presumably the deputy director of the FBI, a man of some experience, doesn't put in a memo something that's just a throwaway line, though maybe he does, or maybe they didn't know each other well and he misunderstood Rosenstein, or he was just trying to write everything down. I don't know, but we do need to, I very much agree with, I think, what everyone has basically said, which is this does not give any grounds, and I really mean this, any grounds at all in terms of any action of Rosenstein that justifies firing him or firing Sessions or curbing the Mueller investigation. And I think it's important to reiterate that whatever he might have said in a private meeting that he didn't follow through on, and there's no evidence he said again over the next 16 or however many months he's been Deputy Attorney General, that gives no grounds to Trump to do anything. Now, it does give plenty of grounds to Donald Trump Jr. and Laura Ingraham and everyone to attack Rosenstein, and let's just hope it stays at the level of rhetorical attacks. I am worried, given the Kavanaugh developments, given other developments, that Trump just decides, you know what, it's just total chaos. I'm good at this Thunderdome moments. This is my chance to get rid of him, and it'll all just look like chaos, and there was kind of a conspiracy, and, we'll have an election anyway in 5-6 weeks, and maybe the Republicans will hang on to the Senate. And so I think it's right to be alarmed that Trump could take advantage of this moment.
Kim?
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves what would actually happen. So then the Solicitor General of the United States would be put into place on an interim basis. That's Noel Francisco. He's also a Republican with pretty conservative credentials, but someone who's highly, I think, respected as a lawyer. So presumably he wouldn't necessarily, I would hope, just go ahead and fire Mueller and call off that probe. In addition, Mueller's been really careful to farm out a lot of these criminal issues to other parts of the Justice Department, the Southern District of New York in particular, and those people answer to Jeff Sessions. So I just want people, viewers, to not be so worried that even if Mr. Rosenstein is fired, that all of a sudden the Mueller investigation is going to end. But it's important to emphasize, why is this so important? And why is the Mueller investigation so critical? Because the Congress is not doing its job of oversight. It's not actually doing any oversight of the president or looking into these serious allegations.
Yeah, but still, in the short term, firing Sessions and Rosenstein, which is what Trump wants to do. He said he's going to do it about Sessions after November 6th. He said he wants to do it with Rosenstein. I think it could do a lot of damage. I mean, I assume that the Mueller investigation would, one hopes, continue. SDNY would continue. We can all ask Congress to do more, but in the real world, that would be a real blow, I believe, to a real attempt. It would be a constitutional crisis. It would be a real challenge to the integrity of the Justice Department and to the investigation of the special counsel, I think.
I agree completely with that. I mean, and I think we are literally in the twilight of democracy potentially in this country, and people need to wake up and pay attention to these things. It's not political, but there are forces that are trying to ideologically divide us, when at the end of the day, someone like Rod Rosenstein is out there every day working for the American people, for the regular person. I can attest to that personally. He is a true public servant.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.